In that sphere of your career and your accomplishments, you are at least 1.5, 2 decades ahead.
The world was surprised. I had so many Muslim delegations from all over the world coming, as if I was the head of state.
Tell us a little bit about Call of Islam. What was Call of Islam?
So Call of Islam is probably the last born of all the important Muslim organizations in South Africa. So the opportunity for them to be true Muslims didn't really inspire them to lead. In fact, they stood away. They did not rise to the ringing challenge, Kunu qawwamina bil qist shuhada'a lillah, stand up for justice as witnesses to Allah. They left that. They stood up for Fajr, and alhamdulillah, Allah will reward them for that.
In Conversation With is proudly sponsored by Africa Cash and Carry, Crown Mines, and shot on location at Hyatt Regency Cape Town.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another edition of In Conversation With. Today I'm really honored to have a guest who has traversed politics, religion, community leader, His Excellency Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah, and thank you very much for this opportunity.
Jazakallah khair, jazakallah khair. Your person, I must thank you for that. I thank you personally in your personal capacity and in the capacity of your office for making time for us. As a leader in the Muslim organization, I'm just going to complain a little bit at the beginning of this interview. You're one of the few people who actually gave us an appointment 2.5, 3 weeks ahead of time. Is this the state of Islamic organizations and Islamic personalities in South Africa and around the world?
I think that there is probably less respect for each other's persons. And we walk through the world as if the world owes us something. It's about my time, me, what I want. And I've learned a long time ago that in the spirit of Ubuntu, I am because you are. And therefore, whatever I want to be, it has to be through someone else. And therefore, you treat the other with respect. And so I think that that's something that I've tried to do, try and be on time for things, try and keep my word, try and set appointments, and then try and keep the appointments. And I can't do that on my own, so I employ someone who patrols my life. My wife my family all knows Gwen, and they understand, they get the diary from her, they all can plan ahead of time that I will be home for iftar or I will not be. And so, alhamdulillah, that makes life very easy if you submit that menial part of your life to someone else.
Jazakallah khair. No, it helps us a lot in scheduling and programming, especially someone of your profile. Where do we start with you, Ambassador Rasool? You have traversed ANC, Call of Islam, diplomat, a premier. I made a comment to someone now the other day, and I said, when we talk about Muslims in the world and Muslims in the diaspora, Muslim minorities, when you look at the size of cities and economies and institutions, I mean, you were premier in 2004. To have a Muslim premier, to have a Muslim mayor or a Muslim senator or a Muslim member of parliament anywhere in Europe in 2004 was still at least 15 years away. So you are, in that sphere of your career and your accomplishments, you are at least 1.5, 2 decades ahead in terms of time and in terms of achievement and idea and democracy and the movement.
I remember becoming premier, which was very natural for me because I worked in the ANC. I brought a reputation for political struggle through the Call of Islam, through the United Democratic Front, through the African National Congress. And people had a respect for me. And when I was elected as Premier of the Western Cape in an 80% non-Muslim community, the world was surprised. I had so many Muslim delegations from all over the world coming, as if I was the head of state, coming to Cape Town and asking the question, how was this possible? I remember hosting Sheikh Raed Salah of the internal Palestinian movement in Jerusalem. I remember hosting Abu Mazen Mahmoud Abbas from the Palestinians. I remember a delegation from the IIIT, the International Institute for Islamic Thought, led by Dr. Jamal Barzinji, all coming asking the same. Prime Minister Erdogan did a state visit to Cape Town, trying to understand how does this work. And my answer was very simple. My answer was that to get into positions of some power and influence, you must remember that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was Al-Amin, the trustworthy, before he was Rasulullah, the one who gave the message. We all want to give messages. We all want to preach. We all want to convert people. We all want to influence society. We all want to exercise power. But we don't start where Rasulullah started, by building trust. And it's trust building. When you are prepared to give your own blood, sweat and tears to a cause, that's the thing that builds trust. You can't sit in your zavia or your mosque and think that by your piety, you are building trust. You are no benefit to society. You are not sacrificing on behalf of society. And alhamdulillah, I think that for me was the thing that made it possible for a young Muslim nobody to become the premier of the province, later to become the ambassador in the United States, and later to be able to travel the world, teaching some basic lessons from Cape Town.
What are the two big lessons from Cape Town you take with you when you go internationally?
The big lessons from Cape Town is that we as a Muslim community are comfortable in our own skins. We are comfortable with ourselves, and therefore we are comfortable with others.
Versus
insecure Muslims.
An example?
An example is a Muslim who stays away from contact with someone who is different, who doesn't eat like him, pray like him, talk like him, dress like him, and worship like him. That's an insecure Muslim, because he fears every contact is a contamination. Whereas the example from Cape Town is that through our contact with people who are different, we were able to persuade all slaves, whether they were from Java, whether they were from India, whether they were from Mozambique, whether they were from the west coast of Africa, whoever came here wanted to be us. And you never want to be someone that you don't know. لِتَعَارَفُوا. That Allah has made you different so that you may come to know one another. How can I know you when you hide in your mosque? How can I know you when you think your house is the only safe space? How can I know you when you make it difficult for me to come into your house because I must take off my shoes? Because I don't shake your hand? Because I have an attitude against you? I can't get to know you. And therefore I can't get to know what motivates you, what makes you the person that you are. And so the first lesson out of Cape Town is, don't fear contact. That is why you will find so many ethnicities under one banner, Muslim, and under another banner, Cape Malay. Whether you were Indian, you were assimilated into being Cape Malay. Whether you were an animist or a Christian slave from the west coast of Africa, once you came here, you made a simple calculation that if all the slaves are Muslim and all the slave owners are Christian, I must be Muslim. So that's the first lesson. The second lesson that we have learned is from Cape Town. We were suffering under the most heinous Islamophobia, and we didn't have the word for it then. For 300 years, we were either banned as a religion, we were enslaved as people, we were segregated under apartheid, and our religion was not recognized. That's Islamophobia for you. But we prioritized the pain of others because we recognized that black people were facing more pain even than we as Muslims were facing. And so we prioritized their pain. And alhamdulillah, in the secure knowledge that if we overcome the pain of blacks under racism, we will overcome the pain of Muslims under Islamophobia. Those are the two lessons. The one is build trust and make contact with people. Don't be insecure in your Islam. Be secure that your Islam can withstand any contact. And the two is prioritize the pain of others. Don't all the time shout in the face of people going hungry, in the face of blacks facing racism, land being dispossessed. Oh, Islamophobia is so bad. The Muslims are under attack. If you make yourself the center of the universe, you cut yourself off from other people.
When I was reading your profile and doing research on you, and with all my guests, I wonder, what makes this person unique? What makes this person? And you just answered that question for me now. I just saw how you took 300 years of Islamic experience and codified it in 2 minutes. That's a skill.
Alhamdulillah. You're being very kind.
No, I mean, that is, I find it very interesting how you took the South African Muslim experience and literally codified it. And I'm sure this is what you talk about, or these are the kind of messages you speak about. You mentioned Call of Islam. Tell us a little bit about Call of Islam. What was Call of Islam? I mean, you hear now and then Call of Islam was an ANC instrument. It was a liberal instrument. I'm sure you've heard of all of these, but for the sake of capturing history and someone who's in the middle of it, who is it? What can you tell us about it? There's a lot of young Muslims who hear about this, who read about it, and I fear there might be a time when people don't hear about it anymore. But it is important for us to record it.
So Call of Islam is probably the last born of all the important Muslim organizations in South Africa. You had the Muslim Judicial Council, you had the Jamiat al-Ulama, all the ulama were there. They were there for decades. They were there when apartheid was born. They were there when apartheid jailed Nelson Mandela. They were there when the Sharpeville massacre happened, but they were quiet. So the opportunity for them to be true Muslims didn't really inspire them to lead. In fact, they stood away when Imam Harun was killed.
Do you ever think that they had their reasons?
I'm sure they had their reasons.
Everyone
has reasons. Whether the reasons are good.
What do you think the reasons are?
I think people were just happy that they were allowed to pray, that they were allowed to observe fast, and so they went very minimalist with the definition of Islam. It was the right to do ibadat, their worship, but not necessarily to engage fully in the mu'amalat of the time. What were the worldly challenges of the time? So they did not rise to the ringing challenge, Kunu qawwamina bil qist shuhada'a lillah, stand up for justice as witnesses to Allah. They left that, they stood up for Fajr, and alhamdulillah, Allah will reward them for that. Then you had the Islamic movement, the ones inspired by Hassan al-Banna, Sayyid Qutb, Maulana Maududi, and they were very politically conscious, but they had another program in which they understood that Allah does not change the condition of a people until they change that which is within themselves. So they spent all their time educating themselves, changing themselves, becoming more pious, becoming more conscious, reading.
Are there any interesting individuals in that movement?
No, they were very good individuals. I have absolute respect for people like
some names?
Ibrahim Badi, Ibrahim Jadwat. I have absolute respect for Imam Rashid Umar, Maulana Ibrahim Musa, or now Professor Dr. Ibrahim Musa. There's a whole range. Naeem Jinnah, Shu'aib Manjra, the Manjra family. They were the people who inspired us. Wallahi, I am so grateful that I spent time in the MYM and the MSA because I learned and grounded myself in Islam at the feet of those. But we also understood what their limitations were. They were people who were so self-changed and transformed, but they had no interest really in transforming society. And so there was an option to transform society, but that was a group called Qibla, led by Ahmed Qasim and others.
We always hear Sheikh Ahmed Qasim. Who else was there other than him in In that category?
In that category.
Of the Qibla category?
No, there were many people in that category. There were some ulama. I know that there was a Sheikh Abdul Rauf who was very active in there. There were people like the Ibrahim brothers, Abdul Salam, who later evolved into Pagad, and all of those. So there was quite a few people that we knew. And they were really inspired by the revolution in Iran. And in their inspiration, they were uncontextual because they wanted Islamic revolution in South Africa for an Islamic state. So, of course, we were inspired by the idea that Islam can also be dawla, it can also be state. But I think we needed something that spoke to
you were very, at that time, you didn't have that maturity of thought that you have now. At that time, you were a very young man. And there were all these different forms, different ideologies, different takes on Islam, pre-call of Islam. So what made a difference to you? How did you read it? How did you decide this doesn't work, this doesn't work? How did you evaluate the options at that time?
So it was a lot by instinct, but then we had to learn, because the moment you turn your back on something or you say, this is not for me, you must understand why. And so for me, the thing was that my instinct for justice was honed because I entered high school in 1976 when the 1976 uprisings happened. That was my first taste of tear gas, a sense of rubber bullets. And so from that moment onwards, by 1980, I was on the Student Representative Council of my school at Livingston. I was on the committee of 81 with all the schools in the Western Cape coming together, and we led a 12-week school boycott in South Africa. And in this time, ironically, the one who introduced us to the kind of Qibla ideology of Iran was Shahid Isa, who was in the class with me.
He's a contemporary.
He's a contemporary, and he later joins the DA. Now, how do you run from Khomeini to Steenhuisen? I mean, I don't understand it, but he will have his own answer. But the fact is, that's the kind of vortex we found ourselves in. By 1983, the United Democratic Front was launched. The ANC called for an internal movement. Alan Boesak, Desmond Tutu, and others rose to that occasion, formed the United Democratic Front. And I remember, my father made me work in his garden for my university fees. And I said to him, Dad, they're launching a big movement in Cape Town today. My father said, what time is this? I said, 10 o'clock. He says, no, you're first going to take out all these weeds here and so forth and so forth. So I do it reluctantly because I have an obligation to him while I know that this meeting is taking place. At 1 o'clock, he says, okay, we're going to clean up, we're going to have lunch, and then you can go. So I ran to the bus stop, got on the bus, took the bus to Mowbray, got on the train, landed in Cape Town, ran up Adderley Street to St. George's Cathedral. There the UDF was born. I just heard for the Western Cape UDF, Trevor Manuel, Cheryl Carolus being elected as secretaries. I'm still signing the registration form. And suddenly I hear any nominations for additional executive members, and I hear Ebrahim Rasool. And I said, what's happening? They said, they're just nominating you for the executive of the UDF. And then I win the election. And I'm on the UDF.
So you've been an election winner since a young age.
Alhamdulillah, I won the election for secretary of the SRC also at 1980. But be that as it may, the UDF was there. Suddenly, I'm now on the executive of the UDF. A year later, I'm part of a Muslim Student Association trip throughout Africa at the end of 1983. We end up in Durban at the headquarters of the MYM MSA. And from almost Isha to past midnight, I'm being interrogated about my involvement in an organization that has communists and nationalists and liberals and people of all ideologies in there. And and the outcome of that meeting is that they're not happy and that they're stripping me of editing the newsletter of the MSA.
So the MSA executive at that time took you to task
for being part of the UDF. But we still kept on. The last straw was when we tried to put together a coalition of Muslim organizations in 1984 to be able to...
Coalition of Muslim organizations.
Of Muslim organizations.
Who tried to put it together?
So it was the kind of initiative that people like Farid Esak, myself, Adli Jacobs, and Shamil Mani, we came together and said, Muslims must have a unified voice to call on the Muslim community not to vote in the tricameral elections. And we got the Zakafan, Sheikh Faik Khamildin was on board. We got the MJC, who asked Sheikh Abdul Hamid Khabir to speak there. Al Jihad came on board, which was another organization of Shia radicals who joined that coalition. And that morning, it was 17th of Ramadan, which coincided with the 17th of June, 1984. That morning after Fajr, I sat with the Amir of the MSA withdrawing the MSA from that because they will not...
Who was the Amir at that time?
It was someone called Bashir Gur from Freiburg. And we sat there and he withdrew the MSA from that because of all the reasons that I had spoken about that happened at that meeting. And that's the idea when the call of Islam, which was at that point on our posters, saying the call of Islam is for justice, the call of Islam is to oppose apartheid, the call suddenly, with that withdrawal, the call of Islam became an organization. And that's how we formed the call of Islam.
So with MJC and these organizations, were they part of it when it started?
They were part of the rally, which was the biggest rally up till that moment in the Primrose Park Masjid, where I grew up. My father was the secretary of the masjid. We got the masjid. The imam was supportive, and we filled that masjid. Qibla tried to disrupt it. That day, they stood up and shouted Iranian slogans, Mar, Shawravi, Mar, Munafiq Khabir, you know, that kind of thing. And we evicted them from the masjid that day. And the rally continued, and the call of Islam became a massive phenomenon, guiding Muslims through the anti-election campaign, through the states of emergency, through right up to the transition when we hosted the National Muslim Conference. So this is what the call of Islam is. The first things the call of Islam did was, one, to affiliate to the UDF, to insert ourselves into the body politic of the liberation movement, and secondly, to affiliate to the interfaith movement of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the World Conference on Religion and Peace. And there was a time when I was simultaneously the National Secretary of the Call of Islam and the National Coordinator of the World Conference on Religion and Peace. And I was the Secretary of the United Democratic Front. And so that was the kind of navigation that Muslims did. And so those who criticize the Call of Islam as being this, that, and the other, I do believe that the efforts of a few young people with Imam Hassan, with Sheikh Khabir, who joined the Call of Islam, with Maulana Farid Esak, people like myself, young students who went to jail, came out and joined the Call of Islam. Those were the people who I think saved the Muslim community from irrelevance. It was the Call of Islam, plus the Ahmad Katradas, plus the Molvi Kachalias, plus the Amina Kachalias. They may not have been your kind of movement Muslims, but they kept the idea alive that Islam was intrinsically for justice, Islam was non-racial, and that's why we embraced black people, when those who criticize us today were making black people as their servants sleep under their kitchen table, made them work from 5 in the morning till 10 at night with very little wages. That was the merchant class that was at work. And we were against that. We were not only looking for justice for black people in the country, we wanted justice for anyone who was being oppressed, whether as a domestic worker of a fellow Muslim or any domestic worker anywhere in the country.
Interesting dates in which this happened. You know, you said when you had the MSA and their position, and you mentioned they spoke to you about communism. But I mean, I'm sure you know that in the early 80s, the issue of communism was a very, very, I mean, in the 80s, communism was, I think it was a bigger threat than Shi'ism at that time to the Muslim world, especially what was happening in Afghanistan and the Cold War and so forth. Did all of that have an impact in the way in which people were thinking? Were people's atheism, communism, non-belief? Were people worried that if your children go into the ANC, into these movements, it's communist, it's atheist, etc., etc.? I mean, those are legitimate concerns.
There's a number of choices, and you take the lesser of two evils. Let me just tell you, for the Call of Islam's idea. Later, there were Call of Islam people studying in Pakistan who would have been part of some training camps with the Mujahideen fighting communism in Afghanistan. So our ability to distinguish in the same way that I can distinguish between an Osama bin Laden and a Yusuf al-Qaradawi, if we all said, oh, reject them all because the one is a terrorist or the one is an extremist, how do you reject all Muslims without judging the individual? لِتَعَارَفُوا. Get to know people. The Joe Slovo I knew was more courageous than the most courageous Imam. The Ruth First, who was killed with a bomb, a parcel bomb, was more courageous than many other Muslim leaders I saw in South Africa. That was the kind of communist I see. I didn't see their ideology, but I let them see my Islam. That changed their mind about Islam, because for them, Islam was what they saw with monarchs and dictators and extremists. When they saw me, and they saw Farid Esak, and they saw Shamil Mahani, they saw here were people who were non-racial. Here were people who were fighting for blacks. Here were people who believed in democracy. Here were people who understood human rights when it was denied elsewhere in the Muslim world. So you see, this is the dialectic. This is the competition for perspective and perception. And in a very real sense, I think we have won far more respect. Ahmed Kathrada, by and large, joined the Communist Party because he didn't hear any liberation in the mosque. When he was exposed to the call of Islam, he said, please make me an honorary member. And so I can go on with a whole range of people who were communists who understood that.
What type of Islamic ideology, belief structure, ideas did Call of Islam depend upon, or what was the sources of Islamic information, Islamic ideology?
So we came at the formation of the Call of Islam with all the readings of Sayyid Qutb, Fi Zilal al-Quran, in the shade of the Quran, milestones. That's all the stuff we had read. Hassan al-Banna, we had studied his work and his persona. Maulana Maududi. We loved Ali Shariati because he was not your mullah who wanted to take power. He in fact opposed it. The way in which the mullahs took power. We loved Ali Shariati's work. from where shall we begin, etc., etc. We had some in the Call of Islam reading the Green Book of Gaddafi very, very strongly. But the way the Call of Islam developed its, I wouldn't call it ideology, but its ideational basis, its base of ideas, was that we had a different approach to halaqat. We did not write a whole manual of which Quran ayah you will do in week 1, which in week 2, which in week 20, which in week 50 for the year, which hadith you will study in week 5, which hadith you will study in week 7. We didn't do that. That was where we believed the Islamic movement, the MYM and the MSA went wrong, because they were formalistic.
Oh, really?
Yes, because they had it all prescribed for the development of the self. What we did was we democratized the reading of the Quran. And so, for example, we would come to a halqa and we'd say, Muhammad Noor, what part of the Quran do you want to discuss today? Sometimes Muhammad Noor would say, I've been very intrigued by this thing that Allah says in Surah Al-Fath about this. Then we discuss it. Other times Muhammad Noor said, I just want Allah to speak. Let me just open the Quran. And we open the Quran, and what's in front of us is what we read. And that took us on an adventure through the Quran, in which if you hear only one side, even the Maududi side, and you will hear, La tattakhdu Yahuda wa Nas. Do not take the Jews and the Christians as your friends. They are only friends of each other. When you open Surah Mumtahina, Allah says, Allah does not forbid you. La yanhaakumullahu anil ladina lam yuqatilukum fid din. Allah does not forbid you from having relationships with those non-Muslims who do not fight you for your deen, who do not drive you from your homes, or do not help others to drive you from your homes. In fact, Allah says, I order you to be kind and just to them. Now that changes the calculus. Because if you only, and Allah warns us about reading only parts of the Quran and rejecting other parts. Read the whole. And what helped me a lot, and others in the Call of Islam, was that when we were in prison, and particularly in solitary confinement, you only had the Quran. And I was, for the second time I was in prison, I made the Quran a program throughout the 13, 14 months that I was in prison. I read it from cover to cover. I made an index of it on toilet paper. I memorized part of the Arabic that I loved. When I encountered it, sounded beautiful to me. I memorized it for use in the Salah, and so forth. But when I looked at the toilet paper, I saw that the ayat of love, of mercy, of cooperation were far longer than the verses of war and conflict. And when you look at the verses of war and conflict, it's often contextual. It was based on an incident, a conflict at that moment in time. When you look at the ayat of love and mercy and beauty and all of those, they were normative. They were the value base of Islam. And so those became for us the ways in which we made sense. Sometimes we'd sit in a khalqa and we would ask, I wonder what Allah would do, or what the Prophet ﷺ would do if he were here facing the state of emergency. Then we'd look for the sunnah in both the Quran and in the seerah of Rasulullah ﷺ. We'd look for how he would have reacted under those conditions. And we loved the biography of Martin Lings.
Okay.
Because it was such a warm biography. It was a biography that when they said this, you could reference it in the Quran. And so you had this interactive reading in the halaqat of the Call of Islam between the seerah and the biography of Rasulullah ﷺ and the Quran, all active, interacting with each other and building. And we also had strategic wisdom. We did not make the mistakes of the other Muslim organizations that constantly fought against the ulama. We knew that the ulama could not give what they did not have. They did not have politics, so it's stupid to think that this one can speak politics from the minbar. The ulama did not have a deep sense of social justice, so they couldn't give it. The ulama did not have strategic guidance, so how can they give strategic guidance? Sometimes they didn't even have courage, so they couldn't give courage from the minbar. And our thing with the ulama was, we're not asking you to go, just open your mosques. And alhamdulillah, we built that relationship of trust under the leadership of Al-Marhum, Sheikh Nazim Muhammad. Ya Allah, that man, he had the courage to open the MJC and to invite us to use the MJC office as almost the headquarters of the Call of Islam. That man had the courage to suggest to the ulama, let Imam Hassan speak at your mosque when it's an important weekend. You can speak about the Salah next week again, but let Imam Hassan come and explain
Imam Hassan Solomon.
What he says. That was the enormous debt we owe someone like Sheikh Nazim. He wasn't your Imam Harun who was assassinated. He wasn't your Nelson Mandela that went to prison. But he provided the opening for young people like myself to thrive in that situation. And so I often say to ulama who tell me to stay in my lane today, I said, if I stayed in my lane in the 1980s, the Muslim community would be in trouble. If Farid Essek stayed in his lane in the 1980s, the Muslim community would be despised today. If Adli didn't have the opportunity to step out of his lane and speak in your mosque, the Muslim community would have been mistrusted today. So don't tell me today to stay in my lane. The freedom we brought you, and I take it further, I say, julle eet die barakat, maar jy was nie by die gadat gewees. Okay. You are eating all the benefits of freedom without having made the efforts.
Exactly. On that point, we'll just pause for a few seconds. In conversation with Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool. We'll be back after this.
In Conversation With is proudly sponsored by Africa Cash and Carry, Crown Mines.
In conversation with Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool. Jazakallah khair again for joining us.
Thank you.
You mentioned a word, interfaith, and you mentioned in the context of the early 80s. I'm just interested to know who else in the world in the early 80s knew about interfaith. Today, interfaith is such a popular word, such a common word, sometimes provocative word. It's a huge political word. It's
sometimes despised word.
Despised word, etc. But as a philosophy, as an idea, in the early 80s, where was it? What were the ideas? And that you were in the middle of it.
Look, we were very conscious of what kind of interfaith we were busy with. There was interfaith, but it was the interfaith of the competitor faith. It was the Jimmy Swaggart versus Ahmadiyyat. And they were competing. They were competing for ideas, for theology, for adherence, for people to convert to them. So we inherited a system, particularly in South Africa, with Ahmadiyyat being here. We inherited a model of competitor faith in which we were afraid of each other, suspicious of each other, because we were also insulting each other.
Do you think the Ahmadiyyat movement had such a deep impact in South Africa?
I think Ahmadiyyat had wherever I go in the world, I'm asked about two people, Ahmadiyyat and Nelson Mandela.
Wow.
So by and large, Ahmadiyyat had served psychologically for Muslims as a major bulwark against anti-Muslim feelings and Orientalism. And he boosted our confidence that indeed this was right. But in a context like South Africa, it could be divisive. But I think he understood enough to tone down in South Africa because he knew that unity was very important and that we we needed to cooperate with others for a political cause. So we inherited that tradition of competitive faith. And then we also had a growing movement of what I call comparative faith. People were beginning to explore. We fast like this, you fast like this, we pray like this, you pray like this. This is permissible for us to eat. This is permissible for you to eat. So it was a comparative faith movement that was emerging, exploring each other's faiths by comparing it with your own. What we did in the interfaith movement that affiliated to the struggle was to move to cooperative faith, where we cooperate with each other
On
issues of justice,
okay. I just want to
on community issues.
okay.
We cooperated in the struggle. And we moved further than that to collaborative faith, where we didn't just cooperate, you from your box and me from my box. And when we have a rally, the imam says a dua, the priest says a prayer, and the Hindu Swami says something else. That was cooperative faith. We now move to collaborative faith, in which we collaborate in the struggle to overthrow injustice. We carried that through the transition, where the National Interfaith Conference picked up the outcome of the National Muslim Conference. The things we discussed in 1990 amongst us was taken over. It was understood by Archbishop Tutu, Gerry Libbe, and other people. And it was said, can we present this to the new government as the outcome of our collaboration, that these are the values we want in a new South Africa? So what I'm saying is there was a very conscious idea of what interfaith was, and we moved it along the continuum of better relations.
At the end of the previous segment, you mentioned when people tell you when ulama, or I don't know if you said ulama or people, but when you are told today to stay in your lane. But of course, talking to you, I see that you have been in this lane of interfaith, or understanding other faiths and engagement for 4 decades. Do you think that, or believe that South African Muslims, South African ulama, South African leadership in a community, I won't say are they on par with you in terms of seniority necessarily, in terms of education, but do you think they are on par with you in terms of what you have experienced and in your vision? How do you evaluate where we are in understanding this space in South Africa today?
My fear is that this deen, this religion, that was founded in the month of Ramadan on 3 simple precepts. Iqra, read. Allama bil qalam, write. Allama al insana ma lam ya'lam, research. Those were the opening revelations of the Quran. That has set up the Muslim community at the height of Medina, at the height of Baghdad, at the height of Andalusia, as the most intellectual religion that you could ever find. Christians in Spain, if they wanted their children super educated, they sent them to the Muslim seminaries to learn math and science, astronomy and medicine. The same with Baghdad's libraries. And I'm answering your question. This is the intellectual heritage. Today, we are consumers of the works of Al-Khawarizmi, the algorithms that govern our devices. We are consumers of it, and Al-Khawarizmi was the originator of it. The canons of medicine, we are now the patients in the hospital, when the canons of medicine were done by Muslims. We observe the stars while others explore the stars, because that was the astronomy that we left the Muslim world. The point that I'm making is, I think the Muslim community has slid from that high intellectualism to non-intellectualism, and I fear that there are parts of us that have become anti-intellectual. we're now against thinking.
That's a very big statement.
It's a very big statement.
Especially the last part.
Because the abandon with which we label things that we don't understand
Example?
can be anti-intellectual. I don't understand what is he busy with, so I takfir him.
An example.
I call him a non-Muslim.
An example of events that you've experienced or things in society.
So it's so easy to takfir a whole Shia community.
But that's going on for 1,300 years, 1,400 years. And that didn't stand.
Exactly.
But the point is... But that's part of it. But this issue of Shia takfir, it is not... I mean, that is as old as Islamic intellectualism is almost.
No. But the point is that Baghdad was the intersection between those two worlds. And Baghdad, not for no reason, became the combustion engine of this intellectualism that came out of difference of opinion. Ikhtilafi barakah. That difference of opinion is a blessing. Ikhtilafi rahmat. That difference of opinion is a mercy because it creates new syntheses. So we want to reduce everything to the same. Believe like I believe. Worship like I worship. Eat what I eat. Wear your beard like I wear my beard. Cut your pants the way I cut my pants. We are in a battle for uniformity. And we are foregoing the benefits of diversity. And so the point that I'm making is that, extremism labels because it can't debate. It wants to die for a cause because it's difficult to live for that cause.
Can you define extremism for me, in your opinion? I picked...
Extremism is anything that strays from the wasatiyah, from the middle. And the middle is because we are ummatan wasatan. We are an ummah of the middle, even when you are angry.
In the year 2024, when we talk in the Muslim community, globally, we seem to be very sensitive to the utilization of the word extremism. And sometimes, I'm sure you will agree with me, we put extremism in the category of conspiracy theory. So no Muslim is really extremist. The Muslim is always practicing his faith. It's just that others don't want him to practice. A Muslim has an opinion. A Muslim is so. And with extremism comes terrorism, global terrorism, jihadism, takfirism, and there's always justifications for that. And I'm saying a lot here, but just your contemplations off the back on that.
So for me, there are two competing extremisms.
Okay.
There's an informal extremism, which can be anyone, but it has been the kind of things we have seen in Raqqa, the kinds of scene we had seen in Tora Bora, and so forth, because there are definite rules that govern how you do things. There are rules of war. You don't kill women, you don't kill children, you don't kill the monks in their monastery, you don't destroy the vegetation, you don't destroy the live crops, etc., etc. So you can begin to see who has strayed from the middle on that side. But there's another...
So you're very clear on that's extremism, on these examples you mentioned.
And when I mention those examples, I am not ignorant of the causes of it. But the Muslim is not driven.
But the causes of this in Bukhari and in Muslim, the hadith, they talk about the numerous hadith and the abwab and hudud and etc., etc., etc. So I mean, people say that's Islam.
No.
I mean, you speak to Osama bin Laden, Mullah Umar, and all of these people involved in these movements. Irrespective whether they agree with him or not, they
will find justification.
Yes, in the text.
But the fountainhead of the text must be that stand up for justice and let not the hatred of a people to you swerve you and make you depart from justice. A Muslim has no option about what to do with his or her anger. It has to be one that always leaves room for persuasion, always leaves room for legitimate struggle. And the South African struggle, for me, is an enormous example of how to, by and large, stay within the bounds of wasatiyah, even when you are. And that is why we invented a description of the South African struggle as militant non-violence. On the counterpart extremists are those who today sit in the White House, who occupy 30% of the French Parliament, who run Hungary, who are making inroads in the Scandinavian countries.
But aren't those two the same sides of the different sides of the same coin?
Absolutely.
Because we all have more or less a conservative worldview.
No, but the point of the matter is that the one is informal extremism, the other one is increasingly mainstreamed extremism. Extremism that now has the power of the state. The power of the Israeli state, for example, to visit a genocide on people. The power of the American state in order to allow that and to arm that to happen. And the power of influence in European states to make their governments turn a blind eye to a genocide.
Where does Iran sit in this? They're also very extreme, very conservative, especially on issues of human rights.
I think Iran has matured.
You believe so?
I believe Iran has matured, that it has learned very bitter lessons from its earlier forms of just being angry, of just fighting the world. It has now added a strategic dimension to it. The way in which it manages its negotiations, for example, on its nuclear, it knows that more than any fighting that it can do, just the possibility of bringing equilibrium to the Middle East through having a nuclear weapon is already changing the calculus. So I think that what is emerging much more is the idea of strategy as central to your decision making. I think often when there is anger, strategy leaves. I think it is especially when you are angry that strategy must be at the table, because we have an African saying, your anger is hot, but it cannot cook. And so you've got to make your anger cook. And the only way your anger can cook is if you add strategy to it. To know who you are targeting, to know how you are targeting, to know the balance of forces between you and that target, and to invite them to your area of strength, and you don't get seduced onto their area of strength. And that really is the issue of how strategy and you know what is the art of war in the Quran? Surah Al-Fatah. The episodes around Hudaybiyah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is very clear that Allah had given to the Muslims that day sakina and ordered tranquility, and ordered them to stick to the word of taqwa, of God consciousness that restrains you. What did Allah put in the hearts of the Quraysh that day? Hamiyya al-jahiliyyah. Allah has put into their hearts that day fanaticism, extremism, emotionalism that comes from the days of ignorance. Those are the two properties. The Muslims must clearly be the owner of sakina and taqwa. Your opponents must always be the possessors of Hamiyyat al-Jahiliyyah. Once you swap it, you have a problem.
Is that where we are now?
I think so.
You think so?
Although, I think there are signs of a strategic revival. And South Africa has helped a lot with that by taking Israel to the ICJ. For so long we thought that the only way to fight Israel is to get rockets to pierce their dome, to knife attacks here, tunnel invasions there. What South Africa has shown is that when we send a legal team to The Hague, to the International Court of Justice, absolutely prepared, fully representative, the most competent people that you can find. They're not arguing an emotional case, but a factual case, a historical case, a legal case, an intellectual case. We have done more on that day as a global community for the Palestinians than may have been occasioned in a long time. And that is why, you know, our forebears in Cape Town, they had lots of adhkar. One of the wonderful ones is, I don't know if I'm going to get the tune right. La ilaha illallah al-ghalibul qawi. There's no God except Allah, and Allah is the one who is al-ghalib, the one who succeeds. Al-qawi, because Allah is competent. Allah knows what Allah is doing. Allah is strategic. Allah is empathetic. And out of those qualities, qawi, comes al-ghalib, success. So that's the story of South Africa's intervention in The Hague. And that is what can change the calculus. And suddenly, we've shifted the narrative.
True.
Israel the victim. Is Israel the perpetrator? Israel in self-defense. Is Israel the aggressor? Al-Ghalibul Qawi. Success comes from competence.
I know many viewers are going to be upset with me because I'm totally going to change this discussion, because we can't continue on this line for hours and hours. And we've committed informally that we're going to have a few discussions actually going through your book and looking at the ideas there and engaging. Do you have a commitment on air for that? The time, inshallah, will...
Inshallah. And Gwen willing.
Gwen willing. I don't want for that. I looked at your period as Premier. And it was probably because of my experience at home last night. 2004 to 2008. That was more or less when, I think it was 2007, we had the first bouts of load shedding. And I remember Alec Irwin, I'm sure it's probably a colleague, a friend of yours, one of the comments, I think we had something happening in Coburg. And the one comment was that a bolt fell down the turbine, and the second one was that there were Chinese who were engaged in some sabotage. For me, I'm just narrating that as a bit of humor to the introduction. Is you were in power at a very, very interesting part of South Africa's history. You were, of course, not part of the Umshiniwam movement. What was it like in the ANC, in government at that time?
Look, let me first say, I sat next to Alec Irwin at the press conference in Coburg,
okay,
at the power station.
Okay.
I almost fell off my chair when he said that.
Oh, really?
I almost fell off my chair. I didn't have the heart to say, where did you suck this thing out of?
Thank you for your honesty, Premier.
But it wasn't. But we were managing it here in the Western Cape. I didn't put generators in my house while people didn't have generators in their house. And I'm speaking about Livanov now,
okay,
the Premier's residence. We had the press conference to discuss the load shedding in the dark.
I mean, I don't even think the word load shedding existed then.
No.
It was just
blackouts.
It was just a bolt.
Yes.
And Chinese who came to sabotage.
Yes. So, but I think that we had a better understanding of how there was this beginning of a perfect storm.
We read now and then in the media that the executive at that time was informed that things are going to go down, and there was a decision from the executive. I'm paraphrasing it, to ignore, not to take action. I mean, you were on the National Working Committee of the ANC at that time.
National Executive
Committee as a premier.
Can I tell you? That's why I was so surprised by Alec Irwin. Basically, Nelson Mandela, in his campaign in 1994, promised 5 million electricity connections because only 20% of the population had electricity. The other 80% had nothing. The fiscal choice that needed to be made was, do we spend our money on maintenance of the power stations and so forth and the upgrading thereof? Or do we spend it on broadening the transmission lines to get the other 80% of the population onto the grid? We made the decision for the latter. let's get more people onto the grid. We understood, and that is where Gear was beginning to say that in the second transition we go back. If we have enough people on the grid, we go back to maintaining and expanding the electricity infrastructure. Because remember, South Africa by 1994 had an oversupply of electricity. Electricity was cheap. It was a competitive advantage, and suddenly the price needed to rise because we were getting more people on the grid, but we were doing it at the expense of maintaining the infrastructure. So that's really, it should have been an explanation we had to give the people at that point, and to say, of course we now know that when we tried to do exactly that, get more energy institutions, get maintenance going, this was the soft money that got stolen. This was why Jacob Zuma put his people into Eskom, into Transnet, into all of Treasury, into SARS, in order to facilitate the savings that were made under Gear. Remember, we survived the 2007-2008 meltdown. We didn't just survive, we thrived. We could host a World Cup 2010, Soccer World Cup. So we had money, but it was those savings that I think were the target of the rogue elements in the ANC, who later became the elements in the government.
How did you become Premier? Why were you chosen? Who were your competitors at that time for that position? Because I mean, you won a good. I mean, the numbers show you were extremely popular.
Yeah, alhamdulillah for that. But look, it wasn't very easy. But the first round, the 99 elections, the ANC became the biggest party in the Western Cape. The DA was formed because the National Party took their 38% and added it to the 12% of the DP. And that's how they became 50%. They locked Gerald Morkel up so that he couldn't negotiate a deal with the ANC, who was now the biggest party at 42%. And so they locked us out of government. But by that time, the National Executive had already declared me as the Premier candidate of the...
As a professional, as a Muslim climbing the career of politics at that time, or rather when you came out of Call of Islam, did you say, you know what, I'm in ANC, I want politics, this is the line I want to take?
Even today, I wince. I have difficulty saying that I was a politician, because it is such a degraded word. It evokes so many negative emotions. I've always thought of myself, when I was the Minister for Health, when I was the Minister of Finance, when I was Premier, I always thought of myself as a political activist. I had a vision. I had an objective, a set of objectives. I wanted to do the best for all people. That's why we call the Western Cape a home for all. I just wanted to do good. By 2007, I knew that was over, because there was no longer a place for honesty. In the run-up to Polokwane conference, where the big fight was going to be Jacob Zuma versus Thabo Mbeki for president of the ANC, I was part of an ANC delegation from the Western Cape, where 70% of us were going to vote for Thabo Mbeki, but not just vote for Thabo Mbeki, we were going to vote against Jacob Zuma. Because I remember saying to people something that Maya Angelou says better: if a man shows you who he is, believe him the first time. Meaning that Jacob Zuma had already been pronounced to be in a generally corrupt relationship. At the same time, the man had faced rape charges of his best friend's daughter. That's the character of the man. That's not behavior. That's the character. And we persuaded the majority of people in the Western Cape to vote against Jacob Zuma. And I did an interview that was on the front pages of the newspapers, why I'm not voting for Jacob Zuma.
Did that weaken the ANC in the Western Cape? Was that strategically?
No. When
wrong?
we came back from Polokwane, there was a Markino poll in the Western Cape that basically said that the Premier of the Western Cape had a popularity rating of 62%, that the ANC had if there were an election tomorrow, 53% of the people would vote for the ANC. We came back stronger out of Polokwane for our stance against corruption. Of course, a few months after Polokwane, the Jacob Zuma NEC asked me to resign as Premier. By that time, I knew that being honest was no longer a virtue in the ANC.
On your Wikipedia profile, I don't know if you've ever read it.
Yeah, I have read it. Yeah.
So in it says that you were removed. It says something to the. I printed it. It's in my bag.
Yeah, because I pay journalists.
No, not that one. It says that you were removed because you showed favoritism to Muslims. I found that out of everything I thought I could find on you, find about you, read about you, that really shocked me that your Wikipedia has a comment like that.
Anyone can be an editor.
Yes.
So that's the
where
weakness
does that come from?
Of Wikipedia.
Because I don't know when that update was done, but that update is there.
But that was the allegation.
Oh, was there an allegation?
That was an allegation that we showed favoritism to Muslims. And it goes to the question that you asked about how I was elected as Premier. Basically, we were heading towards the 2004 elections. The ANC was in opposition, even though it was the largest party. And then, just before that election, we managed with strategy to divide the National Party from the DP, and we won over some people, and we took over the government with about 10% of the old National Party, which became the new National Party, and Pieter Maree and later Martinus van Schalkwyk as the Premier. So again, the ANC showed that I didn't say I want to be Premier. I said, no, let Pieter Maree be Premier, I'll be the Minister of Finance. And so we began to dispel this idea of the ANC in the Western Cape being power hungry. And we served loyally under two National Party premiers, but
under Van Schalkwyk as well.
Van Schalkwyk also.
And he then became ANC after that.
He became
with
ANC.
With and
yes, and Piet Koortman. And basically, what this all meant was that we went into 2004. Thabo Mbeki was now clear that if we win this election, we are going to take the Premier position. I remember fetching Thabo Mbeki when he came to open the election campaign in the Western Cape, which was exactly 20 years ago. He came to open the election campaign in the Western Cape. We went to the hall next to the Masjid al-Quds, which was packed with Muslims overflowing. And he announced there that if you vote for the ANC, you will have Ebrahim Rasool as your Premier. Then, unfortunately, that same night, Al-Marhoom Dalla Umar passed away. The next day at the Vygiskraal Stadium, we had a massive funeral that was not run according to state protocol for a cabinet minister, but run according to the Muslim tradition. And Thabo Mbeki asked me to manage that. We got Sheikh Abdurrahman Sadin to do the qiraat. Nelson Mandela was so moved by me, asked me to go and translate what Sheikh Abdurrahman Sadin had recited. Fortunately, I knew the ayat, and so forth. And so this was how we won 2004. And I'm taking you to a soccer analogy. We knew that if whites voted and the Africans voted, the score was 1-1. We knew that if the colored working class voted and the colored rural areas voted, the score was 2-2. Who has the golden goal? and we identified the Muslim community as having
Whose
the
brainchild
role.
was that? There's always someone in a room who does the reading.
Look,
Before we started, I made a comment about your reading of numbers.
I was chairperson.
Was it you?
I was chairperson of the ANC, leading its election campaign, and this was how we put it together. I wrote the political strategy document, but there was a great team around me. We were very unified going into the election. Of course, there were people, rivals for the premier position, who thought that they ought to be it. Maybe some thought it was time for an African. Maybe some thought it was time for a woman. Whatever, those were, but Thabo Mbeki settled that. And alhamdulillah, we won the election with a national party in coalition. Later they joined us. And that was how I became premier. But I've preceded that by telling you how I ended my premiership because of the Jacob Zuma thing. By that time, I knew that when suddenly suggestions were being made that I must get Dubai World to sell 50% of the waterfront to a particular Indian family, I knew that I can't stand that kind of pressure. And when they asked me to resign, it was a relief, but I was going to resign on my own terms.
You had contemplated resigning before that? Before they asked you?
When I met Jacob Zuma before that, I said, listen, I didn't vote for you. And if you want your own person in, then you can have my resignation.
How was that conversation? What kind of person was he to
He's a very affable person.
What kind of person was he to disagree with? You, and I've never asked this question of anyone.
He'd never show his teeth in front of you. He'd get someone else to digest his food for him.
Wow.
Before me, he was, no, you're the best premier. You're performing very well. People love you in the Western Cape. In fact, we must look at how we prepare you for 2009. And then just a few months later. But I went on television and I explained my gratitude to the ANC because here was a nobody from District 6, grew up on the Cape Flats, could become the premier, could be known across the world. I mean, I remain loyal to an organization that for 100 of its 112 years was a good organization. And my loyalty is about making sure that we get this ANC back on track, that it returns to its finest. It's the same thing. You don't leave Islam just because you had a bad sultan or your imam is not very good or something wrong will happen. You find a corner for you to pray, to be in direct communication with your Lord, to retain your faith, to build your faith, and you exert yourself to renew and regenerate your community. And that's the attitude I take with the ANC as well.
In conversation with Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool, we'll be back after this.
In Conversation With is proudly sponsored by Africa Cash and Carry, Crown Mines.
In conversation with Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool. Ambassador, despite whatever happened with you and Jacob Zuma, you were still nominated by him to be our ambassador in the United States of America. That's probably one of, that is sort of one of the highest manners in which a president can express his faith, to send you not just as an ambassador, but to the United States of America, Russia, UK.
Look, I'm smiling because of the irony of the question. You know, I went to address ISNA,
okay,
the Islamic Society of North America Convention in Chicago in 2005. I made a speech there. Part of the speech was televised. A congressman who's Muslim, Keith Ellison, saw part of that, asked if I could have breakfast with him. I had breakfast with him on the morning that I was returning to South Africa. And he said, you know, your speech reminds me of the kind of narrative and way of speaking of a friend of mine who is now a senator in Illinois. And that's how he introduced me to the idea of a Barack Obama. And he said to me, this friend will come to South Africa next year. See if you can meet with him. So I knew the name now. So my office all knew the name. And then in 2006, this unknown senator from Illinois comes to South Africa, wants to meet the president, the deputy president, ministers, this, that, and the other. And no one has time to see him. But he spends, because he's now got so much time, he now spends 2 hours in the office of the Premier of the Western Cape. And we're discussing all kinds of things.
What kind of person is Barack Obama?
He's a very friendly person. My wife asked me that night, do you think he can be president? I said, no, I don't think so. I think he's too callow. Meaning that I didn't think that there was enough depth in his strategic understanding of things. And so I ended that by giving him a lithograph of Nelson Mandela's first speech on the parade. Then, of course, that unknown senator becomes, in 2009, the president of the United States of America. And then I get a call, can I come and see the president? And the front page, or the one page of a newspaper, had a picture of me handing over this lithograph to Barack Obama. And then I get invited to come and see the president at his house, Umshlamandlovu, in Pretoria. And I go there and he's sitting there with the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
This is President Zuma?
This is President Zuma. President Zuma.
Zuma. So he just, because he came in just then?
2009. Yeah. And he said to me, Comrade Rasool, we messed up. We didn't see this man when he came to South Africa. But you saw him. Can you go to Washington? So it wasn't about talent or skill necessarily. It was much more about the fact that...
But it was your talent and skill that led him to you, of course.
Anyway, be that as it may. But that is how I ended up. And throughout those years, we had Barack Obama and I had a critical but friendly relationship.
What were your big criticisms of? I mean, that was also a very interesting time. When I read your book, I saw the names there, you know, and a lot of those names, although they were not involved in the Arab Spring, but a lot of the ideas, the ideology, the movements, where they came from geographically, you know, it all just, you know, had some relevance or influence into Arab Spring. And you were there at a very critical time. A lot of people blame what we have in the Mideast of problems on Barack Obama. I mean, America can never do right. If they intervene, it's a problem. If they don't intervene, it's a problem. But I mean, look, the Obama policies on the Mideast. Even in America, they blame it for that.
I came there in 2010 to the USA. The Arab Spring started in 2011. And my advice to them was, and I said particularly to President Obama, you went to Cairo. You called out the Arab masses to rise for human rights, democracy, and freedom. They are now responding. You can't blink. And he was under enormous pressure from the establishment to intervene in the Arab Spring, but his first instinct was to kind of let it happen and not intervene.
But by the time he wanted to pull the brakes, it ran away with everyone.
Yeah, but then, further on to that, when the Morsi government was about to be installed, I had spent a week in Cairo, a meeting with the Sheikh Mohammed Badi, the
Muslim Brotherhood guide, the general guide of the Muslim Brotherhood.
I had spent time with Morsi. Khalid Al-Qazaz became a great friend still today. He was heading international relations, and all of these people. And we sat for days just discussing ideas, learning from South Africa, what should they do, what should they not do, etc. The result was that the first Muslim Brotherhood delegation or the Freedom and Justice Party delegation that came to the United States, landed at Dallas Airport and came to my house for dinner. And we sat through and discussed. The next morning, first thing, I was at State Department preparing State Department for their meeting with the Freedom and Justice Party people. And that was, and the same thing really with Ghanouchi, and intervening with the Syrian Free Army, etc., etc. They all came to my house in Washington, and really talking through what does freedom mean. And it's in that we had to make a distinction between liberty and libertarianism. Because liberty is freedom with rights. Libertarianism is do whatever you want to.
Interesting.
And so we really, and the same thing with notions of authoritarianism. Because that's what the Arab world was largely consumed by, and the idea of a what I call regulated freedom, using the words of Foucault, that every right must be seen in relation to other rights and the rights of others. So those are the kind of ways in which we had these wonderful debates, and I mediated those debates between the Arab Spring, some of the Arab Spring people, and the administration. Of course, the irony is that in 2013, I was bringing Barack Obama for his state visit to South Africa, and we sat in the presidency where he and President Zuma had this press conference. And that was on July 1, 2013. And he was asked about the Arab Spring. And his answer, because then there was already the siege of Rabat.
Yes.
And his answer wasn't reassuring. And I knew that something was going wrong. He got onto his official plane. I got onto the flight from Johannesburg to Washington. When I landed in Washington and put on my phone, I saw that Morsi had fallen. And by and large, Barack Obama had succumbed to those who were advocating counter-revolution in the administration. When I heard Barack Obama in September that same year justifying, he said that Morsi had a slight majority and didn't govern inclusively. He said this in the United Nations. And I thought, you have an even slighter majority. Show me all the Republicans in your cabinet.
Ambassador, we're running out of time. So many interesting things. I want to catch up on a few quick issues.
Okay.
The Ministerial Hajj Committee or Committee on Hajj. Can you give us an update on that? Have you concluded your work?
We've concluded our work.
Is the work public?
No, the work is not public. On the 30th of November, Alhamdulillah, we handed the report to Minister Naledi Pandor. We are awaiting her acceptance or amendments to that report. We understand that much has happened between November 30th and today in terms of Gaza.
Okay.
That she was leading South Africa's efforts.
Okay, in terms of time.
In terms of
times in the
and may not have had all the time to read it.
Oh, is there anything in the report you can show? Any interesting principles?
Look, I think...
Because I've heard previous interviews of you, so I'm trying to understand what are the big principles that you see need to be changed or introduced in that Hajj environment?
Look, the Saudis definitely want a greater government involvement, and because they'd like to negotiate the quotas directly with our government. They'd like to negotiate the conditions of Hajj directly with our government.
Was this told to you by the Saudis? We want to deal with
all
government.
The key, yes.
We don't want to deal with...
No, they didn't say we don't want to. We prefer to deal.
We prefer.
There's a diplomatic language that I think we can learn.
Yeah. But the Saudis told you in clear enough terms.
It has enormous. I mean, the president and the minister spoke to the Saudis, the crown prince, and suddenly our quota jumped by 1,000. and we can jump it even further, but they want that kind of direct. Our government is very concerned that they should not step over the boundaries of secularism.
And so what did you recommend as the Commission?
We recommend...
If you may share some of the principles.
We are recommending, by and large, that we can have government involvement without that, because it is not in the religious affairs of Muslims that the government is intervening. They are intervening in the consular affairs of any citizen. Even if there's a South African criminal overboard, we owe that person consular affairs.
Is SAHUK in any way threatened by the recommendations? I mean, have you recommended to dismantling, revamping, relooking at SAHUK? Or those organizations that you were part of it?
I think, without giving too much detail, I think we do speak about at least a reform of SAHUK, maybe even a successor to SAHUK, but there is a need for a body like that. There is a need, and if SAHUK's constitution is changed, if its modus operandi, if its tendencies, for example, towards monopolization is changed, then we don't need to reinvent the wheel, but we need some fundamental changes.
Okay. The ANC in the Western Cape, after you left, it's struggling. Why?
Look, I think that the ANC has scored quite a few own goals. I think it has systematically lost the Muslim community.
Why?
I think...
Or what is it the ANC did?
No, I think many Muslims interpreted my sacking by Jacob Zuma as an affront to Muslims. My aunt say, we're not voting ANC anymore because you're not there. Be that as it may. I also think that that they have systematically lost the colored community as a whole, and I think we have lost enthusiasm in the African community. Before the African community, you could rely on Kailicha, Philippi, Guguletu, Nyanga, Langa to come out 80-90% to vote, stand in queues till 2 o'clock in the morning, but they will vote. That enthusiasm is no longer there. And I think it's partly to do, and to be honest, I think Helen Zille did a charm offensive on the communities of the Western Cape. She's even charmed the radio stations and so forth.
She grew the DP from just under 2% to 20%.
Yeah, no,
she's a formidable opponent.
She's formidable, and the ANC didn't realize that you need to play chess with Helen Zille, not dumb. And then I think on the other hand, the corruption has really eroded support for the ANC, and I think failures such as load shedding and all of those things are put at the door of the ANC. So the ANC has a hard climb back. So
can they climb back in the Western Cape? We 2 months from the elections.
I think.
Sorry, I also saw your name on the leaked list. Are you standing for office again? Will you be standing for office? So all of that in one.
I will have discussions about it. I'm in a very favorable position. Okay. I need to weigh up whether my work in the DBSA is more valuable than my work in Parliament and so forth. So that, inshallah, I will make that decision. I'm using the month of Ramadan for some istikhara. But you know, you can't be a member of a party and say we won't win. But let me tell you
the numbers
that I think the Western Cape can be won back, but not immediately. Like I realized that after the 1994 defeat of the ANC in the Western Cape, I said to comrades, this is a 10-year program. And alhamdulillah it was. By 2004, we won it.
What do you tell ANC leadership in the province today? What kind of relationship do you have with them?
I've got a...
I mean, is there a working relationship or is it a more informal relation?
More informal. I didn't involve myself in...
Are you not part of any formal structures other than your branch
and so forth?
Okay.
I enjoy the company of the Veterans League because they are as concerned about the legacy of corruption and all of those kind of things. So I enjoy their company.
And that was my next question. Your ex-boss, President Jacob Zuma, and the MK party, Everyone was blindsided by that.
Look, let me say this in 3 paragraphs to save you time. I think South Africa's position in the world is so important today. We saw it how the West panicked when we convened the BRICS summit. We saw how they threatened to withdraw the AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunities Act forums hosting rights from South Africa, because they're seeing South Africa leading the multilateral world that is being born. Secondly, what South Africa did with the ICJ against Israel is just so critical. It has given the Palestinians, for the first time, a strategic advantage that we've never had, so much so that even Biden has to chase the narrative that has emerged out of it. So for me, South Africa's geopolitical position means that you cannot afford, never mind how many problems we have with the ANC, we cannot afford the ANC out of power, otherwise we sink back to the position that we were in. And that is why the DA would write a letter to the US Secretary of State to say, please intervene here, we will be helpful to you. And we know how they will be helpful to the United States by turning back the ICJ and all of those kind of things. So we can't afford it. So we're going to have to use the fiqh principle of the lesser of two evils. And so the numbers. Jacob Zuma comes at a very inconvenient time because he's probably wanting to take about 20% away from the ANC in KwaZulu-Natal. What that means in the country is that about 6% could be taken away from the ANC nationally. But there is the possibility that if 15% of the Muslims of the Western Cape stand by their principles as they stand by their principles on Palestine to march to the ANC on election day, that means 15% comes to the ANC in the Western Cape. It means about 4% nationally comes to the ANC. Nationally. And that, in a sense, helps to maintain the ANC's hold on power to complete the job. Afterwards, we can do what we want to. Hopefully, those of us inside will reform the ANC, clean it up, get rid of the bad people. But we will at least maintain the momentum. Now, Lady Pandor may have wanted to retire, but she can't retire now. She's got unfinished business. She's got to see the Israel thing through. We've got to make sure that the follow-up to this is to take Netanyahu to the International Criminal Court and charge him, together with the President Herzog, together with Gallant.
Are these the kind of discussions happening within the ANC?
Yes. They're giving us all the evidence.
I mean, in the ANC, is this the kind of conversations that are happening?
Yes. This is really, we are busy with the next steps on the ICJ. That's why we didn't let up.
Will we see you there when the ANC comes back into power?
Let me do the istikhara first.
Sure.
Never do things.
What is your unfinished business? In life, in your community, in South Africa, personal?
No,
You see, the noon gun went off as I asked you that question.
Yeah. Let me tell you, I've learned from Nabi Lut's wife. She looked back and she became a salt pillar. I don't want to look back. There's lots of things that I'm not happy with, but I think we have experimented with some wonderful ideas in the Western Cape that I think should be done nationally. That's why our growth rate was 5.8%, because we employed Bambananis, 20,000 of them, to keep communities safe. We can do that again all over the country. I think we can be able to get community development workers to push back poverty. And those community development workers we had in the Western Cape were able to give people seeds to plant, so that the one neighbor planted tomatoes, the other one cabbage, the other one this, the other one that. And they exchanged it every day so that everyone could have food. Those are the kind of initiatives that I really think could be done. And maybe if there's an opportunity, those are the kind of wisdoms that we can share, inshallah.
And in your interfaith journey?
That continues.
In your authoring and that?
That continues. I mean, we took it to one of the highest levels when we had not a Christian service for Nelson Mandela when he died in the Washington National Cathedral, where all the presidents are buried from. and where all the presidents are inaugurated in the Washington National Cathedral. We had Nelson Mandela's memorial service there. Ibrahim Musa was there. Alan Busak was there. We had Quran reading there. We had everything. The cathedral was so impressed. They asked me if they could host the first Muslim Jumu'ah in the cathedral. And that's what we did. So this is work that we do, building trust all the time, building trust, so that when people plot against you, they must know you.
Ambassador Rasool, you have 1 minute to the camera. What is your message to South African Muslims? Whatever you want to say.
I want to say to South African Muslims that you don't know what a powerful example our 350 years has been for the world. The Ummah is in enormous trouble. There is Islamophobia where we are minorities. There's authoritarianism where we are majorities. The Ummah is in deep trouble, and they're looking to South Africa because they see in South Africa the happiest part of that Ummah. This is not the time for us to go off the rails. This is the time for us to stand up and lead. We have shown that we can lead our government, who can lead the world in the ICJ at The Hague. And that's our power as a small minority. Let us invest in enhancing that power and putting it at the good disposal of the Ummah in general. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
In conversation with Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool, Jazakallah khair for being frank and being open and making time for us. Jazakallah khair. Barakallah fiik.
In Conversation With is proudly sponsored by Africa Cash and Carry, Crown Mines, and shot on location at Hajj Regency Cape